Marriage today isn't what it used to be, but probably not the way you thought. Throughout most of history, marriage was not a relationship based on mutual love, but rather an institution devoted to acquiring wealth, power, and property. But what is modern marriage? During an era of rising divorce rates, gay weddings, and couples simply living together, is so-called traditional marriage a thing of the past? I sat down a short time ago with award-winning author and historian Stephanie Coontz. Her latest book is called Marriage, A History from Obedience to Intimacy, or How Love Conquered Marriage. I asked her about her contention that marriage has changed more over the past 30 years than it did over the previous 3,000.
Well, for thousands of years, marriage really wasn't about the relationship between a man and wife, or even a man and wife and his kids. It was about the relationships between two different families. It was a way of turning strangers into relatives, of making political alliances, even making peace treaties. Wives used to be called peace weavers in many different languages. And then about 200 years ago, and only then, we invented the radical idea that marriage ought to be about love. But even then, it was really as much about authority and about female dependence. And right until the 1970s, men were legally bound to play certain roles in the household and women others. So in the last 30 years, we have turned marriage into not only a love match, not only a very individualized match, but also a very private relationship that isn't imposed on you by law or gender stereotypes. And so we're all kind of scrambling to figure out, marriage has never been more potentially satisfying, but it's also never been more optional. How do we make it work?
You also talk about how in the early days of this country, most marriages were not marriages performed in a church, performed by a minister. There are two people, I believe Abraham Lincoln sort of got married this way originally, going, okay, we're married.
Well, in America, of course, if you were in the Puritan colonies, you were more likely to be married in front of a church. But then you could move. America was such a young country, you could move to another area, and if you said you were married, who would look into it? As late as the 1830s, one judge said, look, we don't want to inquire too closely as to who's been properly married or not, because if we did, maybe a third or more of these kids would be illegitimate.
It's also interesting that your take on it is that when they had this, what seems like this huge humanistic break, and thought, let's get married because we love each other, which seems to make marriage so much more appealing. If you really love the person you're with, it actually made marriage in somewhat far more demanding and in some ways more likely to end in divorce.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the big paradoxes and trade-offs that's kind of hard to wrap your mind about it. The very things that have made marriage more potentially satisfying than any couple I ever read about in the past would ever have dared to hope. The things that allow us to make it an individual relationship to meet your needs and my needs both also make it possible for me not to get married if I don't want to, or for us to say, well, if it's not working the way it has the potential to work, maybe we could leave. So the very things that have strengthened marriage as a relationship between two people have weakened it as a universal institution that everybody has to enter and stay in.
And you have this great test of marital IQ, and you talk about this notion of there was a sort of golden standard for marriage that we imagine the 1950s had, and it really wasn't perhaps as good as we imagine it was.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, there were good marriages and bad marriages in every time period, but you know, at the very end of the 1950s, they took a poll of housewives, and even the ones who were happy said, 90% of them, we don't want our daughters to do the same thing. We don't want them to get married early. We don't want them not to be able to support themselves. So there was an undercurrent in the 1950s. Of course, some marriages worked, but boy, the ones that didn't, there was no place to go because society was in massive denial about things like incest and abuse.
That brings me to one of the questions on your marital IQ. Americans have been getting more and more tolerant of all sexual activity. People assume true, but it's kind of a trick question. You say false. They're more tolerant of private consensual sex, but
less tolerant of coercive sex, less tolerant of adultery. Attitudes toward adultery have gotten more disapproving over the last 30 years. And boy, when you compare it back, we look back to the Victorian era, you know, when everything seemed so prim and proper. The woman there was expected to put up with it if her husband had affairs with prostitutes or mistresses. So for most of society's history, mutual fidelity was not as high an expectation as it is today.
And you also say in 1889, the age that a girl could legally consent to sex was 10, 11, or 12. In Delaware, it was 7?
Yes, and she could consent to marriage at that time, too, yeah.
What was it that made us change those laws? There's still debate sometimes about the notion of the legal age of consent,
right.
And statutory rape. What drove the change in that law?
Well, a couple of different things. In the late 19th century, the emerging women's movement began to think that it was wrong, that women really were not old enough to say yes to.
At the age of 7, you couldn't
Yes.
meaningfully give consent to get married?
Yeah.
Who would have thought?
Or sex, because you know another thing that people don't realize, at the end of the century there were more prostitutes per capita than there are today. Yes, more middle-class girls stayed virgins until they were married then, but more working-class girls were forced into prostitution. So this was a reform movement at the time.
One of the questions is the growth in the number of couples living together and even having children without a formal marriage ceremony or license reflects a sharp break with our previous legal and religious traditions. True or false? I would have thought true. I lived in the 60s, but that is false.
Well, it's true in comparison to the 50s and the 60s, but if you go back in history, in medieval times, the Catholic Church held that if a man and woman said to each other, you know, I take you as my wife or my husband, if you said that out by the haystack, out by the kitchen, and you said you'd done it, you were married. And that was all there was to it. It was only quite late that the church and the state began to demand that you had to be married by a priest or you had to take out a wedding license in order to be married.
When did the state really get involved with having licenses and keeping records?
Well, in Europe it started in the 16th century under both the Protestant regimes and the Catholic ones. In England it didn't happen until 1753. And until that time, for hundreds of years, if you said you were married, if you acted like you were married, you were treated like you were married.
What about divorce? The Bible talks about divorce, and what's the rule there? In those days, if you proclaimed it twice and gave her a note, you're done. Sounds like that could work. Okay.
Well, there have been a lot of periods in history when the divorce has been easy. Of course, the Christian tradition is one of the few religions that actually prohibited divorce completely, but also prohibited it for both men and women. But throughout the medieval ages, there was this interesting little trick that you could get out of marriage. There were two ways. For the upper classes, what you could do is you could say, you know what, we were related. The church had this rule in the Middle Ages that you couldn't marry anyone who was in the 7th degree related. That meant...
This is the original game of 6 degrees of separation.
That's right. Now only it was 7, you know. So, and of course, everybody was that related in the Middle Ages. So all you had to do was say, oh my goodness, I think this person is a cousin, and you could get a divorce. Or you could say, if you were a commoner, it was more likely to say, if I were married to somebody, I might say, you know, my conscience is killing me. Barry and I exchanged vows out by the haystack before I married my husband, Will, here, and so I have to go live with him. And the church would say, yeah, you did.
So, if we still use that system, there'd be no lawyers. One of the interesting things, too, in the book is you look at into the dim past to try and tease out what the origins of the first traditions of marriage were. And the best guess by some anthropologists is it started as a sort of trade for food.
Well, no, that's what some anthropologists used to say, and...
you like the Indian version.
Yeah. There's been all these debates. Was marriage invented to protect women? Was marriage invented to exploit women? The more I've studied it, the more I've come to see that marriage wasn't about the relationship between the man and the woman at all. It was about turning, as I said earlier, strangers into relatives, having peaceful connections. There are a lot of societies that have variations on the saying, they are our enemies, we marry them. The Maori of New Zealand say, you know, you can make a link with gifts, but that link can be broken. But if you make a link between two people and create a new person with a foot in both camps, then those people are relatives forever.
So originally it was turning strangers into relatives. Nowadays, when you get married, you end up with simply some strange relatives. This is fascinating stuff. Marriage, a history from obedience to intimacy, or how love conquered marriage, by Stephanie Coontz. Thank you so much for stopping by.
My pleasure. Thank you.